It's really my pleasure to welcome all of you. We have people signing in right now from Australia. We have people signing in from the south of Europe, the north of Europe. We have a few people signing in from the US, and we probably have people participating pretty much from all over the world. So this is going to be the first webinar on strategy simulations, what it is, why we created it, and really why it works. And today is going to be an interactive webinar. And we really encourage you to ask questions both during and at the end of the webinar. Now, we will try as best as we can to answer the questions in a kind of a running fashion. And then in some cases, we may save them up and make sure to answer them at the end. And Adelina will help us make sure that every question will get answered either during or at the end of the webinar. And there'll be plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. So we have two speakers. We have myself, Chris, founder and CEO of Strategy Tools. And then we also have Harvey. And Harvey Wade is one of the most experienced facilitators that we have. He has been joining and running sessions in different parts of Europe. And Harvey will be joining for the last 20 minutes where he'll be sharing some of his insights. And we'll do a kind of an interview and a Q&A with Harvey and myself. And then you guys are absolutely invited to dial in and ask any questions that you would like from either myself or Harvey. So let's start with a brief background introduction. And this is the agenda that we're going to go through today, where we have 6, almost 7 different chapters. And we're going to try to do a combination of many different small stories, while also keeping a red thread and sort of the big picture, how and why we've been developing this. And you can really trace the beginning. So the first story I'd like to share with you, the beginning really goes back to this Harvard article. And some of you may be familiar with the works and the research and the writings of Professor Chris Rangen. The reason why this article is really the starting point today is this has been a foundational piece to my work and research, and also our work over the last, well, pretty much 18 to 20 years. And what Chris Rangen wrote was one of the big challenges that we face in the context of modern working life and knowledge-driven organizations was that you have a lot of smart people. So you have a lot of smart people that have a good education, they've sort of done well in their professional life, but probably they may be required to change. And probably the organization they're working in, and most likely the industry they're working in, is subject to change. And what Chris found was that change was not very easy. So this article talks specifically about if you're working in a knowledge-driven organization, which most organizations are today, and you have a very capable workforce, you have smart people, you have good leadership, how do you enable change? And I know many of you participating today, that's a question that many of us struggle with and have been struggling with and will continue to struggle with. But it's teaching smart people how to learn in order to drive new behavior and eventually a big change. And this is Juan Carlos Amaton. He is co-founder and CEO of Remora XYZ. It's a smart IoT fish company from Costa Rica. And he was one of the first startups, and it was one of the first international startups to go through the scale-up simulation. And what Juan Carlos said immediately afterwards was like, wow, you know, I've been in the startup space for a long time. He's been building companies, he's been starting companies, he's been participating in accelerators. And he went through the scale-up simulation, and his immediate feedback was, wow, every startup should learn this. And that learning component is really important in the stories that we're sharing today, because we believe that what we have with the simulation that we will be sharing with you is actually a big part of what Chris Rangen was struggling with. Like, how do we help smart people learn in their settings? Now, learning can happen in school, in education, but of course, learning can happen on the job. It can happen in a leadership role. It can happen in a startup role. It can happen in a government role, in an ecosystem role, in a innovation cluster role. So learning takes place as a part of a larger development, and that is a key word for us today. And what we're going to show you is that although the focus is simulation, there are many pieces to that puzzle. So you'll see the simulation, but what's important to us is to show you that there is much more to it, and there's much more behind it. And specifically, that means that even though you may see the money and the cards and the simulation board, there are books and tools and software and a lot of different pieces to that large puzzle. But if we take another step sort of back in time to the original writings, if you will, of Professor Johan Roos, one of the things that he saw, so still in the context of teaching smart people how to learn, but teaching smart people how to learn about strategy is another key component in the background. So Johan's research back at IMD in the 90s was he saw that most leadership teams were very ineffective in their strategy process. Now, translated, they weren't able to learn, discuss, share, and then align because they had a very locked-in way of working on strategy. So the learning is important, and the how do we work differently on strategy is another important element. And you'll see that as we proceed, that the learning component and the working differently on strategy is a second very, very important component to our stories. So that's a very, very sort of high level, almost philosophical background. So first thing we're going to cover is the intro. So what are these strategy simulations? Why did they get started? And who are they really for? And I want to take you to Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. And the MBA program at CBS has for many, many years been quite renowned in terms of their experiential learning. They have a lot of different simulations. They're using Lego Serious Play. They have a lot of leadership training. So as an educational institution, CBS, particularly at the MBA program, is renowned for working differently on the learning and development. What you're seeing here, which is a photo that maybe some of you have seen before. So this is the first full-time MBA program that we ran with a transform simulation. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, there are 3 different simulations at the moment. This is the first time we ran a MBA program. So this is one group. There's about 15, 16 people around this table. There are 4 different teams. And this was a 4.5 hour session as a pilot. Now, what's interesting was this was a strategy learning exercise that happened outside the traditional classroom. Students were not mandatory required to participate, but there was a significant number of the MBA candidates that were intrigued and interested. You know, what can I learn from this? How can I learn differently around strategy? How can I maybe challenge my strategic thinking? And maybe most importantly, how do I understand strategy, innovation, corporate finance, leadership in a more integrated way? And I think this is one of my favorite photos from that session. What we see in the simulations is that there's a lot of concentration, there's a lot of focus, and as a consequence of that focus and concentration, there's also a lot of discussion and debate in terms of what strategic choices should we be making. And sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you make choices, sometimes you make what we call micro decisions that end up being very wise strategic moves. And this is a very typical photo where you see some of the teams while enjoying a short upward trajectory, while the team on the right-hand side, with the gentleman with the green sweater, Adriano, and his teammate, were maybe not in the same positive space. So again, this was a 4.5 hour session. And at the end, these guys with Adriano in the middle came out on top. Now, what I want you to sort of see in this photo is what I call the smiles and the energy and the emotion. Now, I've been teaching strategy in business schools for close to 18, 19 years. And it's really hard for me as faculty and as a teacher to get this kind of energy, to get this kind of smile, to get this kind of positive underlying emotional state in a classroom setting. One thing that we see very, very, very clearly with the simulations is when you run it correctly, when you let people work through it and learn the things they're supposed to be learning, 95 out of 100 times, they'll come out with this very positive, high energy, which also triggers a much better learning format in their cognitive capabilities. So having MBA candidates learning in this format is a very, very powerful mechanism that feeds into some of our other stories. And it's interesting when we work with business schools in different ways, and we work with different sort of users, both at the MBA level and the executive level, we get very, very positive feedback. There's a very strong, we call it market pull in that learning MBA and executive space, which has been really an interesting journey for us in terms of where do we use this. But there's much more, both in terms of the simulations and also the use cases that I'll show you in a second. So again, if you've been following our development over the last year or so, you've probably seen this, but where we are right now, there are 3 different simulations. So the first one is Scale-Up. The Scale-Up is designed for that early stage entrepreneurship, scale-up, startup, incubators, accelerators, early stage venture companies, national innovation agencies, and business schools. And the key takeaways from it is really how do you build and successfully scale a company. The second supercluster, so that focuses more on the national or at least the regional level. It's much more on clusters of innovation, of networks. It's about regional and national policies. And it's about how do you successfully build an ecosystem and scale that ecosystem to create new companies and generate new wealth. The last one you see on this photo, that's Transforms. That's very, very focused on strategy and transformation. So with it, we can work on strategic challenges, innovation strategy, transformation architecture, resource allocation processes in light of transformation challenges. There's a big decision-making, leadership, team component to it, but it fits really, really well with corporates and with business schools at the more senior level. Now, what's really important for us is this. So I touched on this in the introduction. So while we may see the simulation and the boards and the card, because they're very visual and very easy to see in photos, to us, there's really a bundle. So what you see in this photo is the tools on the bottom here. So the strategy tools startup series that you see here, that's really the foundation. So to kind of get your hands around this bundle, you really want to start with the tools. Understand why does the tools exist? What problems do they solve? Who are they for? How can they use them? And the entire strategy tools startup series is built to build better startup companies. Then you have the guidebooks, and the guidebooks are typically between 25 to 35, maybe 40 pages. And each guidebook kind of covers each tool and helps you learn and understand more of what's behind the tool, different tools, and how to use them. Then we have the software, then we have the simulation. And then we also have what we call the strategy cards. And the strategy cards are, again, connected to some of the tools, in this case, the scale-up map. And this entire bundle allows you, either as a facilitator, as a trainer, as a coach, as a faculty member, as a consultant, or in the internal organizational developer, it allows you to pick and choose. And that is really important because you may have different preferences. Some may like some of the cards and they like some of the canvases. Others may like the software. Others, again, may prefer only the simulation. So that bundle thinking is really important. And the same goes for the transform. where there's a pretty significant bundle of tools. And the tools, again, is the foundational element that everything else is built on. There are the guidebooks, and the guidebooks allows you to go much deeper into the tools. There are the strategy cards, there's the software, and it's a simulation. So if you're designing a session, and that session can be from 3 hours, it can be a full day, it can be a 2-day, it can be a 3-day session. We have faculty members that want to do teaching over the entire semester using different parts. And that's really the key. You can pick and choose and put together the bundle and solution that is appropriate for you in the transform space. And then finally, of course, with the SUPERCLUSTER. So here we've been doing a lot of work, working with the Norwegian cluster program, working with some of the international cluster programs, working increasingly with the EU level cluster programs. So there's a lot of content, there's a lot of tools. And again, you can pick and choose what are the right pieces for you. So we really like to use this illustration that we've been developing around these simulations. It's really a number of different Lego pieces or Lego bricks. And then it's really up to you to pick and choose and assemble the solution that is appropriate for you. So if you want to bring this into a business school at the bachelor level, well, there are certain elements that may be much more appropriate. You want to bring it into an accelerator program. Well, again, there are very different components you want to bring in to create that good solution. You want to bring it into a very large, say it's a global organization going through a massive transformation process. Again, you want to pick different tools, different guidebooks, and then maybe go into the simulation a little bit differently. You're building a new national cluster program. Again, there are different pieces that you can assemble. And one of the things that you learn as you kind of get into the material is how to better understand these different pieces and how to assemble better solutions. So some of the topics that we cover, and this is particularly interesting to business school faculty, is that the scale-up bundle covers entrepreneurship, lean startup, funding and capital, finance, leadership, and teamwork, while the other simulations will cover other elements. And I'll show you a few more examples of that as we proceed. So one thing that's been really important to us going back effectively years is how do we use visual strategy tools to build better startups? Yes, there are a lot of tools. So lean canvas, business model canvas. I mean, these tools are excellent tools if you know how to use them, but we still feel that there are gaps missing, there are tools missing. So one of the tools that we've been developing, one of the tools that's maybe most used with startup and scale-up companies is the scale-up map. And with the scale-up map, you can start with the canvas and the PDF, and you can print it, and then you can add the guidebook. Or you can expand and you can add more tools. So when we work with accelerators, incubators, national innovation agencies, and ecosystems, we say, you can actually, building on these tools, you can teach entrepreneurship and develop new entrepreneurship skills much more differently, much more agile than maybe you did in the past. So these are photos from an accelerator program in Ireland. So this is just July this year. And what you're seeing here are about 12 or 15 participants representing actual early stage startup companies in the aquaculture space. And this is a pretty typical setup. So this was a 5.5-hour session. Now you can see the participants around the table. But as you can see in this photo, there's also the tools in the back. And this is really important because it's not as visual, but a big part of the process, a big part of the learning, and a big part of the transitioning into your private or personal use case is actually shifting from the table simulation to the paper tools or the digital PDF, the digital software tools. And we're really focused on the discussion and the learning as opposed to simply winning when we're going through the simulation. So what you can see here is actually a discussion around some of the key elements, and say some of the key questions. So in this photo, you're seeing 2 different teams. There's a total of 4 teams around the table. And we're discussing one of the strategy challenges that they have just gotten into by drawing what we call a bust card. And the bust card opens up some of the negative consequences or the bad luck elements in running, building, and scaling a startup company. So having time for that conversation, that discussion, or that we call the learning framing, is a big part of the simulation process. Now, most facilitators, whether you have one group or you run many parallel groups, will use this, we call it the combination of working elements. So you'll have the participants around the table running the simulation. After the simulation, you may want to transition into, so let's leave the simulation behind and let's talk about your actual company, your real life company. But you can bridge the experience moving from the simulation and into working with your real life challenges and your real life problems and your real life scale up strategy by using the tools and using the software. So we're seeing a very good fit with accelerators and incubators. And we're really seeing that, we call it real life learning case that typically happens in a 3-month or a 30-day accelerator program to fit really well. And as we see forward for the next couple of years, we expect a lot of accelerators and incubators to be using the simulations to basically build better startups in their local communities and ecosystems. Because what we're learning from the entrepreneurship simulator is very applicable to some of the challenges that startup ecosystems have pretty much around the world. How do we teach better entrepreneurship skills? How do we move beyond the current product market fit paradigm? And how do we secure the right investor to develop value both for investors and for real startups? But those are things that we're typically covering in the scale-up session. Now, one thing that we kind of have the question of is, well, you know, this looks interesting, but how did it all got started? So I'm going to show you a few photos that we never probably showed before. And the whole development of these simulations really started from a challenge. So I was invited by my friends at the Norwegian Cluster program to, can you help us explain and maybe teach entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship challenges without just giving a presentation? And that was a challenge. And the way that we tried to solve that challenge was basically by mocking what would a learning simulation for startups, scale-ups within a cluster framework, what would that look like? So the photos you are seeing here are the very first mock-ups that we created that very quickly developed into this. And this is the first ever test run that we had, where we had the leadership team and the chairman of the board from the Norwegian Tunnel Safety Cluster. And they went through as effectively guinea pigs #1. And it was a really powerful exercise. It was really powerful feedback. And that really gave us the positive feedback, like, you know, this makes sense. We can actually use this to develop significant new skills, even though we're not necessarily startup founders ourselves. Now that fueled our curiosity. And then just a few weeks later, I was traveling to Turkey, and on the plane down, we finalized the sketches for the Transform, which kind of rapidly developed into slightly more advanced sketch, and then rapidly developed into what we call a design process. And this is actually a photo from my living room, where we, over the count of a few weekends, really iterated multiple sessions to get to the development and the design that we have today. And in that iteration, we would bring in Lego pieces, we would sketch out new components, we would try to bring in relevant trends for transformation cases. And equally, as we're testing this, we were testing this with very senior business leaders. In this case, this was the managing partner for KPMG, and then also representative from the National Norwegian Innovation Agency. And the feedback, again, was very positive in driving the development and fueling where we took this next. And again, one thing that we realized was very frequently this positive emotion, this laughter, that led to better discussions, that led to better learning. And as we were bringing in more and more and more advanced components, more and more complexity into the simulation and the learning process, we realized you can actually take the complexity level quite far as long as the underlying emotional state is very positive. So now, what is the impact? What's the impact? So when we look at the world, we could sort of see 10 different user groups. Of course, many of you would have different interpretations, but we see 10 different user groups. And we have, over the last year, been able to test and deploy and run sessions for pretty much all of these in very different settings. And we have successfully run sessions with many different consultants, corporate strategy teams, with top management, including the CEO. We've been applying it across many, many different education settings. We have accelerators and incubators. We have different entrepreneurship companies and people, ranging from single startups, multiple startups, venture capital firms, ecosystem players. We've been piloting and running for national innovation agencies, innovation clusters. And right now, we're actually still in the process of rolling out the first real use cases for the learning development space and also for the national government space. Those are now happening. And what we see is that we really open a lot of interesting questions. So some of the questions that are coming out of all those sessions, it's not, this was an interesting experience or this was useful, but we get new questions. So more sessions drive more questions for us to try to solve. One of the questions that came up last week when we were running a session in London was like, this is really powerful. How do we use this to develop 10,000 new scale-ups across all of Europe? And that's really a big capability development more than anything else. So here's a photo from one of the teams in London, really diving into some of the complexity and some of the strategic challenges behind building a scale-up. And what's interesting, again, we're very often seeing this deep concentration. So here we have Salim and we have Andy, really focused, absorbed, if you will, into the simulation process. Equally in the same workshop, here we have Nick and we have Rosalind, and she came in from Malaysia, where she represents MAGIC, the Malaysian government's innovation creativity agency. And here we're also looking, how can these simulations and solutions, how can they be applied across the Southeast Asian ecosystem? And what would that look like? So very interesting questions in terms of building more startup and scale-up capabilities in different ecosystems. Another question that we come across that we've been facing more recently is, how do we achieve strategic alignment across a global organization, and how can the simulations be relevant to that challenge? And this was a session that we ran a few weeks ago in Oslo, and what you're not really able to see is really the strategy team and the innovation team for a very large global organization that actually comes together and use this as a strategic alignment process more than anything else. And what they're actually doing, without explicitly working on it, is aligning around what should be our company's innovation strategy moving forward, where you have different perspectives from the strategy side, you have different perspectives from the innovation side, in terms of what would be our best build, buy, partner, co-invest, co-develop strategy. And it's really a powerful discussion that happens when you bring the right people around the table and you use the simulation to have big strategic discussions, not just for the simulation, but for real life companies. Another question that we've been facing increasingly is the, how do we teach strategic leadership? Because you can talk about it in the classroom, but how do you design powerful experiential learning exercises where the participants at the MBA and executive level actually take away the things that we want them to take away, as opposed to just listening to the professor? And one thing we're working on right now, together with BI, which is the one of the largest business schools in Europe, is actually even more customizing content that allows us to connect we call it the company cards. It's really the industry vertical to match the key programs the business school is running. Now, this would allow us to go even more into the energy transition. It would allow us to go even more into healthcare. It would allow us to go even more into changing the energy landscape of the future. So I think that as we proceed, we'll see even more customization in terms of the content aligning with executive level education programs. One thing that's really important is, what's the underlying research? Now, you can look at this and say, it all looks interesting, but what's the foundation? And this is really important to me personally. It's really important to us as a community, that this is grounded in real, powerful, proven research. And one of those big pieces is actually Professor Johan Roos, Bart Victor, and Matt Statler, that about 15 or 16 years ago published the original Playing Seriously with Strategy piece. And this was a pretty short article in Organizing Strategy and Entrepreneurship. And it became kind of it kind of sparked a evolution in the management field and in the learning field of how do we connect the strategy process with what they called a serious play to articulate different types of working, Lego pieces, with different emotional states, a more playful state, as opposed to a corporate PowerPoint spreadsheet state. And the Playing Seriously with Strategy research, and also the research that followed, because there's a lot of research that followed, is really foundational to the work that we are now doing. And this has been developing. I mean, here's a follow-up article on towards a new model of strategy making a serious play. And again, this kind of research is very foundational to us in the development that we're doing. So a big shout out to Johan Roos and Bart Victor for the original research that we lead on. And it's interesting to see how that research has then spawned the Lego Serious Play movement. And there are thousands of facilitators and hundreds of training programs around the Lego Serious Play. And as we've been sort of speaking, we realized that our work and the powerful work that Johan Roos and his team has been doing, it's really almost converging. At least we're trying to learn as much as we can. And the more we learn, the more we realize that there are very strong similarities in our thinking. And obviously, they're far, far ahead. But it's interesting, in Johan Roos and Bart Victor, they just published last year a new article on how it all began, the origin of Lego Serious Play. And again, we recognize a lot of the items that they talk about in the work that we now are doing. So we're looking forward to this. Just a side fact here that a little bit later this year, Johan and I will both be at the Peter Drucker Forum, where this concept of how do we play seriously with strategy is still a very powerful discussion in the global management field. So you should really follow up on Johan's research, and they're doing a lot of interesting work in what they call the next generation of Lego Serious Play. And that's a big foundation for us of having that research. So we're going to go into kind of the next chapter in terms of the insights, because we've now been running a lot of these sessions, and we're probably counting close to 50 in total. And of course, we've been learning. And one of the things that we learn is that you can really put pretty much anyone, ranging from young startups to very senior, very, very senior business leaders, through these simulations. And if you frame it in the correct way, people get a lot out of it. Now, this case, very briefly, it's on the innovation superclusters, where you have China and Switzerland, Costa Rica, and Norway, and Denmark, they're competing at a national level. And this was with a board of directors for a authentic Norwegian energy cluster, where the participants in a 2-day workshop format used the simulation to be introduced to what is a cluster, what does it work, what are some of the projects that clusters do, what are some of the growth strategies a cluster does, and then aligning the learning exercise on day number 1 with a more well, more fully aligned strategy process on day number 2. So using the simulation at the board of director is something that we have been doing, and we've also seen some really good results coming out of it. Equally interesting, very, very different, is when we go into what we call ecosystems. So in the ecosystems, there are typically no specific organizations. There may be many, many different organizations overlapping. You may have people with very, very different backgrounds, but they may not necessarily be working together. And what you're seeing here is it's actually from Switzerland, where we ran a session a little bit earlier this year on the Swiss tech startup ecosystem. And we had different people from across that ecosystem sort of come together for a full day session in Zurich. And again, a very, very different use case where we have discussions at the ecosystem level as opposed to a specific company or startup level. And as it happened, there was also a European heat wave. So we realized that just to keep the participants alive and keep them hydrated, we had to be serving them both coffee and water and also a handful of beer. And as you can probably guess, that slightly improved the working mojo. But the reason why I want to share this is because you can actually run this in a very corporate setting, office hours, office location, during daytime. But you can also easily kind of transition this into a slightly more social structure where you do it afternoon or even after hours. You can do it with some food and wine. Playful framing than only this case is the Helsinki. So we were just visiting Helsinki probably 2 weeks ago. And interestingly, working with Helsinki, again, we were kind of working at the ecosystem level, meeting very different people from very different backgrounds with very different focus, and working primarily at the supercluster. We really used the supercluster simulation as a learning format for the ecosystem to come together and say, what are the strengths that we have and what are the pieces that we need in Helsinki? And over the course of a few days, we ran multiple sessions with very different stakeholders, but also in very small groups that allowed for really, really powerful conversations. And again, that's something that we find to be very important. Having time and space for the conversations that happen is an absolutely critical aspect of a successful session. The very last example I'm going to show you, which leans more towards the corporate side, is around transform. And one of the things that we've been developing just recently, and this has just come out, we're still sort of rolling it out and testing and learning ourselves, is the transform leadership roadmap, which connects the corporate strategy with the simulation in a very fascinating way. So the first question here, which the participants would be asked before they start the simulation, is what are the strategic ambitions? What is your company going to look like in 10 years? How significant a transformation will be required to get there? And then how ready are we, or how aligned are we as a company for this transformation? So you want to complete this first. And of course, depending on the outcome, that's going to frame your information as a facilitator. And then when you go into the simulation, you kind of have these tools either on the wall, on a screen, maybe you even also have them on the table, because those are really the foundational elements that you work on in that simulation. And as you work through the simulation, and in this case, this was a energy company, and it's an energy company like most energy companies going through a pretty large, pretty massive transformation, and maybe they haven't fully developed the capabilities and the skills and the languages and the strategic framework for this. So they're using the simulation to build capabilities that fits the big strategy challenge the corporation has. And then at the end of that session, you go back to your individual learnings, and then what do we do as a company? What is our transform intent, roadmap, and first steps? So this is one example of how you can frame a simulation in a very hands-on practical thing that fits the corporate needs and challenges. So it is not a learning exercise. It is not a playful, friendly ecosystem exercise. It is extremely applicable and focused on the corporate strategy challenges at hand and how we can use simulations to learn and solve those challenges in a more intelligent way. And I believe that as we go forward, we're going to see a lot more of this bridge building where you work on the real life strategy challenges using tools and simulations to solve real problems in real companies. So with that, we're going to open up for our guests. So we have Harvey Wade with us. So Harvey, you've been running multiple sessions and you've been participating in this space now for pretty much the last year. How would you, in very basic terms, describe what are these strategy simulations?
Yeah, hi and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are. How would I describe these strategy simulations? For me, I think what was really amazing was it was a totally different experience. I've worked in innovation strategy for many years. I've seen many ways to try to drive, future thinking or transformational thinking. And I would describe it as it's so experiential. It's something that every time you run a simulation, something different happens, and you can't predict it. It depends on the individuals, and it's very lifelike, and you can start to go through. So for me, it was the practice of going through these simulations. You start to understand, what do I actually need to do as an individual? What does my company need to do? What do the people I'm working with need to do? And you don't get that experience from sitting in a classroom, and you also don't get that from working in a standard type of workshop. And so for me, it's the fact that it brings an experience and a mindset change, which I haven't seen anywhere else.
Excellent. So I'm going to do a few more questions for Harvey, but we're also going to open up for you guys. So now is a good time, if you're interested, to either be asking questions of me, but ideally of Harvey. And we're going to sort of have a conversation here that may be initiated by me, but hopefully followed up by anyone, whether you're in Brazil or in Australia or elsewhere. So Harvey, my next question is really, you've now seen several sessions in different settings. What has been some of the things that may have surprised you the most?
I think what surprised me has actually been, it's one of those things that sometimes when you do these things, you think, well, I've done it once, I've learned it, I know how to do this. And each time you experience it as a facilitator, as a participant, something else happens. There's a different way of, or there's something new that you see, that you experience, that might be the people you are experiencing it with. You can sometimes play with some very competitive people. You can sometimes play with people that are very collaborative, and it brings a real different environment, and cultures mean a different thing. So for me, the most surprising thing is how different it is every time you experience it.
Now, if we have somebody on this webinar that, let's say they are, well, let's say they're a change agent within a large corporation. So they may be in HR, they may be in innovation, they may be in strategy, but they're trying to drive that organizational change. Why and also how would this be relevant for them, you think?
I think the relevance comes, what I've experienced is if you start to challenge somebody on the way that they are running their organization, you get to a very defensive and closed off conversation. I think if you, somebody is open to, well, I don't think everything's going perfectly, but I'm willing to have a look at this. By using simulations, it almost becomes a safe space for me to try something out, to look at something. And actually the practice, and I think you've mentioned this already, Christian, by having those experiences, you start to understand what you do well and what you do not so well as an organization. And the key thing is then bringing back that into your organization, and that's the relevant part. You start to get insights, you start to get understanding, which you wouldn't get because you wouldn't be open to it if you weren't going through this process.
That's good. Good point. And just to follow up what Harvey was saying, one thing that you may have seen early on, but I can repeat it, is that in the simulation, the participants aren't working with their own real life company. So whether you're a startup or a scale up or a corporate, you are assigned, you're given a company card, and you have to take on the management role of that company. Now that company, depending on the goals and the outcomes, may be a clean energy company, it may be a mobility company, it may be an aviation company, it may be a seafood company, it may be well, it may be a digital health company. And you're going through the motions within that context. And then it's really up to the facilitator to highlight what are some of the key elements that we would like to discuss and learn. And my question to Harvey is really, you've seen it quite a number of times now. So what are some of the different ways you can see this being used for yourself moving forward? Different learning outcomes in different settings.
Yeah, I think that's great. And finally, I managed to get the video working. So hello, everybody. So the different ways that I can see it working is, for myself, is I do a lot of work with organizations, but first of all in an innovation space. So I can see organizations really who are working in their industry, starting to think about what's coming in the future, what do we need to be ready for. And certainly where you're working with an organization that's probably been doing something the same for many, many years, why should I experience and invest in different business models? Why should I think about exploring in the future? What's in it for me? And you can start to use the simulation to explore those different horizons and make those cases. In terms of working with more strategic teams where they're looking at the future of their organization, they can start to play different situations. They can start to understand, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? They can start to do the what ifs in a safe space. And then I think what's really important for when I'm working with leaders is that leaders understand the mindset they need to bring in. Well, what do I need to say to my people? What do I need to think about for me? If I'm not thinking about this as a leader, who is? For me, having experienced it and also facilitated it, you start to see, well, what are the gaps in knowledge? What are my blind spots that I have? And what do I do with that? And for me, the real power is, yes, it's the simulation, opens up the conversations for you then to have a more in-depth conversation using the canvases, using the software, to be able to then move from it being a sort of a one-off workshop that's been great, but they go back to the day job, to actually something that is fundamentally something shift, and you can then work with people in a longer fashion to start to build and bring in the new way of thinking, the new mindsets to start to transform that organization.
That's well said, and I think that's something just really important to us that we would like to emphasize, is that going back to this idea of the bundle, there are many different Lego bricks, and as you get into this, whether you are a coach or a consultant or a business school faculty or an internal change leader, you can pick and choose. So you don't have to dive into the full-scale simulation. You can start with, again, some of the tools and some of the guidebooks, maybe some of those strategy cards. And then eventually maybe you see that this simulation makes sense. And then as you get better at it, you may also see that it makes sense to run it significantly for hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And Harvey, I have one more question right here. So we've sort of been exploring this idea of using these bundles, so using the simulation to build capabilities across a big organization. Now you have background from Cisco with a lot of employees. So how do you see this fitting in terms of building capabilities at scale?
I think having talked to people within Cisco and other people running large organizations, the challenge that they always have is how do we get this learning throughout the organization? How do we make it visible? How do we start to get that to more than just a small group of people? I think the key thing is, first of all, for me, change always starts at the top, so you need to start to work on the mindset changes. But what becomes really, really interesting is the fact you've got a toolkit that you can start to use. People understand how to use that toolkit, which can be an offline or an online. So you've got then a platform of working. So one of the things when I was at Cisco, you had a lot of teams that were virtual. You often didn't get face-to-face, but you can work in that project mentality. You can see the work on the canvases in a virtual way. And that's the key thing with scale, is it's very hard to scale in an organization with one person. But as you build that capability, as the tools start to become more familiar and being used in more widely in the organization, then that's the way that you would scale. The other piece is thinking of this with an organization as not sort of, one of the things that often you do is you do that sheep dip. Right, if we sheep dip enough people through it, they'll be all changed. It needs to be, accepting that if you've been thinking the same way for a long or many years, a one-off experience is not going to change you. You're going to have an insight, but you need to have that embedded, and the way of doing that is through sort of programs, activity, probably building a number of people within the organization that are able to bring in the learning, and that's a very flexible model. It's not all just sort of locking in, an external person for life. You would build that capability within, and then the tools and the software are available for then that organization to begin to expand that within their own capability.
No, well said, and also just to mention it from our end, although we didn't show it in the slides, all of these simulations are also available in the cloud, so you can run it digitally. Now the learning outcome and the experience is very, very, very different. So it's not something that we focus very heavily on, but we see that in some organizations that the digital is almost a requirement. So that's something that's also available. Now we're going to see, Harvey, if we have any questions. I think we have a very quiet audience with us. If any of you have any questions, either for me or for Harvey, we'd be very happy to take them. And we'll give you just a second to see if we have anybody out here. So I'll give you one more question, Harvey, before we move into sort of the closing minutes here. In terms of learning the material, how easy or difficult do you think that is for people that maybe don't have your experience in the innovation space as a former innovation manager? So how difficult or easy is it to learn this material?
I think that's one of the great things, is that by being a facilitator, you learn all the time. From the way that I've done this is, first of all, there's to learn the mechanics of how the actual simulations work and how they fit together. That, to be honest, can be learned fairly quickly. You just have to sort of be willing to study what's going to come up and what those things are. In terms of how you facilitate it, you can either facilitate it very sort of strictly and as the rules, or you can start to play a more flexible way. And one of the things that Christian showed earlier was, some of the pre-work that you would do with the group to understand what their level of learning is and where they are in their current position. And then there's you as a facilitator can then drive it out. For me, yes, it is easy. There are sometimes questions that you realize that you personally have a gap in knowledge that you need to go and explore. That just makes you more ready to run the next session. I think as long as it's for one of the things that I would say, if you're doing that within an organization and you work out that as an organization, we don't know the answer to this, it gives you, okay, but we need to find it. It then enables you to go, we now know why we need to understand this. So for me, in terms of the actual simulations, they are fairly straightforward to learn. How that links together, as with all good facilitators, practice is the way that you start to learn this. And the more times you do this, the more times it becomes familiar, and you start to see lots of situations and you know how to respond.
That's a good summary, Harvey. So Harvey, stay with us. We have just a few slides left, and then we're going to see if we have any closing questions before we wrap up. One question that we get quite frequently is how do we get started? And there are different ways. The honest answer is that we are piloting and testing and iterating different ways. And we have people reaching out from South Africa, from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Japan. And right now we say that, you know, you can join us in one of our sessions. We have upcoming sessions in California. We have upcoming sessions in Belgium. We have upcoming sessions in Austria, and those are the ones that are currently official. And then we have a 2020 schedule that we'll be releasing in a few weeks. You can also book, and you can have Harvey come down, or you can have me come down, or you can have somebody else come down and run a demo and show you, or run a session, and you'll get a chance to see. But then there's also a number of people that say, you know, I want to learn this. I mean, I want to get to Harvey's level. And for those, we're very much piloting different ideas. And one of the ideas that we will be launching soon is the digital learning platform. We call it a Strategy Tools Digital Academy. And one of the first programs that we'll be launching is an online learning program that leads into a learning and eventually certification for the simulation. And then we will be developing and testing different ways of getting people onto this. And what would you say, Harvey? What is your biggest recommendation for people that may be curious but not really know what to do in that space?
If you're curious, I would find an opportunity to get along to a session and to see what happens as a participant. I'm very happy to, you know, let's have a conversation if you're UK based, or you're want to come in and get people to run a session. For me, this only comes alive in practice, only comes alive when you see it happening. A lot of people are very skeptical, potentially, if you use the word play. Well, it's business, I don't want to do that. But actually to see it as a simulation, to see it as something that's going to transform, that's when it starts to come alive. Some people are more willing to take a risk than others. I think if you know what your organization is like, and you need to test something out, let's find a session. So I would say come along, explore, see what that is, ask more questions. Christian's showed you some great photos. That is a common experience. It is a fun experience, but it's also a great, insightful experience that you get as well.
I think that's a good way of wrapping it up. So we are, I mean, effectively here. I think the biggest observation from our side, you know, the original development, if you will, started about 10 months ago. And in that space, we've been developing 3 simulations, and we've been running close to 50 sessions. We're learning a lot, but we're probably only just scratching the surface. So I think one of the things that's going to happen in the next 10 months is that we'll be getting a chance to deploy them in very different settings. I mean, we have a large number of business schools that are now asking to get this into the curriculum. But we will be learning more, and we'll be getting more experiences in where it fits, and maybe how does it fit even better with the board, how does it fit with management team, and also very importantly for us, how does it fit with our partners? where we have people like Harvey and probably many of you that are on this webinar of how do I get on this? And that's a learning journey that we are on to together.